personally, I just love kind of thinking outside the box and looking at things that have been overlooked and trying to understand like what's the opportunity there, and like taking something that people think has got no juice left in it and finding a way to spin it, I think is a great creative challenge.
Hey there, James here, and you're listening to the Own the Moment podcast, the show where we explore the complex and always evolving landscape of marketing, advertising, and branding, and try to get to the bottom of what it means to be a truly memorable brand. The Own the Moment podcast is brought to you by Como Technologies, a self-service, complete customer engagement platform that helps you cut through the noise to truly connect with your customers and retain and grow those connections over time. With Como, you can build and deploy new campaigns, activations, promotions, and programs in days, not months, and our software is used by some of the world's biggest consumer brands, from Heineken to Budget, Goodman Fielder, Foxtel, JLL, Williams Racing, and McDonald's. Learn more at como.tech. Today's guests are Anson, Parker, and Sebastian Neylan. Anson is the Chief Product Officer and Sebastian Neylan is a Senior Growth Marketer at Up, an innovative Australian neobank which has quickly amassed over 600,000 customers and a legion of raving fans. Let's face it, no one likes their bank, it's just you kind of have to have one. And despite what their fancy TV commercials will try and make you believe, no one really feels like their bank cares about them. But something about Up feels different. It's a brand that feels fresh, vibrant, and authentic, to use a cliched brand term. From a marketing perspective, they're ticking a lot of boxes. Differentiated branding, strong and bold copy, and a uniquely Australian tone that seems to resonate with its customers. I think my biggest takeaway from this discussion is that Up do something that almost every brand says they do, but ultimately very few actually follow through on, and that is to put the customer first. Anson and Seb shared countless examples of this in the episode, from how to deal with customers who've closed joint bank accounts, which may coincide with a breakup or divorce, to how they help make their users' morning coffee runs more delightful. We had a fascinating discussion about being creative in a heavily regulated industry and what it means to build a truly customer-centric banking experience. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Anson and Seb, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much,
Thanks,
James.
mate. Good to be here.
So one of the things I wanted to start with was, I see people all the time on social media sharing pictures of sort of Up Bank merch, whether it's coffee cups or t-shirts or stickers. Tell me, for a bank to have customers that sort of willingly share on social, that feels fairly unique. Tell me a little bit, about how you guys think about building a brand that customers can actually connect with.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun, I think, to see that advocacy out there, and I don't know that we always knew that was going to be the case when we first started. I think we definitely felt that there was an opportunity to really kind of connect with people on this journey and be a lot more sort of, consultative and open around where we were trying to go. And I think we just had some early, I think on the merch thing, it's funny, we had some early, sort of before we launched, we had a bit of a waiting list thing we were building. We had a newsletter, and I think on the bottom of one of those, very early days, we had this kind of like hashtag of like reboot banking. We really wanted to kind of get in there and fix banking. We were like very much like a software, let's fix all the broken things mindset. And we just thought, does anyone read this newsletter? Let's just put a little merch link at the bottom and we'll give people a t-shirt that says reboot banking on it. And we all of a sudden, hundreds of these t-shirts were going out. We're like, why do so many people want these t-shirts? And just somehow clicked with us that we were building a brand that people kind of wanted to wear. And I think we just kept leaning into it more and more over time. And it's sort of become part of what we do. I think it's think through that.
What do you think What do you think it is about the brand that that makes people want to actually connect with it? Because again, I think just banking and I guess fintech or, financial services in general, it just doesn't feel to me instinctively to be one of those categories that is that's the thing I want to, put on my back. And what do you think it is about what you do, and I guess maybe how you do it, that connects with people in such a nice way?
You want to take this one, Seb?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was just going to say Anson can build on this, but just one of the things I think has been like the people we've hired, like a lot of the people in across the company, but especially within marketing, growth, design. Like there's barely a banker to be seen. There's a lot of people who come from sort of design backgrounds, from different creative industries, fashion, things like that. Myself, I come from the travel sort of sector originally, and so when you got a whole bunch of minds who come from that sort of a place, I think you're not coming at it from a bank angle. Obviously, we've got the tech infrastructure there and the reliable product to rely on. But then when you can sort of have a whole bunch of creative people on top of that with creative license to kind of go for it and push the boat out, I think that's a pretty good place to start.
How do you think, speaking of pushing the boat out, I mean, you guys are obviously in like an extremely regulated industry. Most of your competitors, I guess, are sort of not, pushing the boat out much on, on brand, product, tech, innovation. How do you guys think about sort of walking the line, I guess, between, being trustworthy, which, I guess is of utmost importance as a bank, but still, being a fun, playful brand? Is that a challenge or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like there's a few levels to it. I mean, I think that I guess where a lot of the team has come from, like Seb says, like basically no bankers on staff. Most of us have come from a creative or software world, and and I think the attitude of just presenting who you are unapologetically, speaking in a tone of voice that you would speak to other people and not seen as kind of wall between, sort of the corporate and the consumer that needs to kind of all come out the same sort of flavor, but just kind of being authentic, I think is a big part of what makes up what it is. And so I think that, yeah, with that in mind, it's just, kind of, I guess, having I mean, maybe like courage, I guess, to feel that like we don't need to legitimize up by looking and talking like a bank would normally talk. And I think that it does put a certain responsibility on you to be good, right? Like when you don't have, I think it's kind of the same thing that happened with like Silicon Valley, where all of a sudden you could just wear a t-shirt instead of a suit. It's like you can do that,
Right.
but you have to sort of back it up by knowing what you're doing. And I think that it's the same thing with Up. Like we can, there are times when a sense of humor is not appropriate in banking and communications with a customer. And I think you need to be respectful of that. Like you need to take things seriously, but it doesn't mean there aren't opportunities for humor and levity and fun, but you have to do things well. Like if you are constantly having issues with downtime or, crashes and you're just making a joke of it, right? Like it's a very bad look. So I think it's kind of a luxury you have, I think, when you feel like you've got a really great product, your technology is really sound, you've kind of got the customer's interests at heart. It's almost like you can come out from behind the kind of curtain and I think be more open and honest.
Yeah.
And
I think that
I was just going to add
sorry,
to that, James. Like I think it's like thinking about it from like a human behavior level first and foremost, and that's something like that drives a lot of our decision making. And just an example of that with Anson was saying like you have to suss the tone of the situation sometimes. There's a nice example I love, which isn't highly visual, which I think we do really well, is with our 2Up joint account product. The whole idea of it is it's really easy to spin up and it's really easy to close down. Now, most banks wouldn't make a product really easy to close down, but we kind of do that because it's built for modern relationships, and we know that sometimes that's how things pan out. And if you close down your 2Up account, one of the little notifications you get has a little bit of a line of copy that says, like basically, it's okay, all you need is you. And I just think like a tiny little example of that. And we've had people kind of screenshot that and share it and whatnot. But it's just like, that's the vibe. It could be like, joint account, relationship ending, that kind of thing. But I know like we thought through even aspects of the micro copy with that stuff. And, it kind of reflects the situation and perhaps us being like, it's all good, you got this.
See, I think that's fascinating for me because it's like, it is those details, I think, that really, like when you look at a brand and a product like Up, and of course there are countless other great examples of, innovative sort of disruptors, I guess, where, you know, it's that focus on the detail, which I think really sort of, right, it, you know, I mean, it goes back to sort of eliciting feelings, I guess, right, which is, you know, right, if you've just gone through a breakup and you're trying to close down a bank account and it's cold and, you know, you're not getting any love or whatever, I mean, it's like, you know, it's not a great experience. And to be able to actually help people, get through that experience or whatever is really, really interesting. You mentioned 2Up, which is your sort of joint banking product. One of the things that I think is really interesting from a branding perspective is that it seems you've sort of leaned into this 80s sort of, I don't know, video game, arcade game sort of vibe. Again, I think, you know, quite bold for banking. Tell me, how did that come about? I'm interested, just as you brought it up. You know, how did you guys decide to lean in on the gaming thing?
Yeah, it's,
You run with this one.
I mean,
this is your
yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I think that I mean, part of the answer is that I guess, you know, the origin story of 2Up is that we had sort of one of our top requests was joint bank accounts. But, you know, Up has a very, you know, quite young demographic. So we're about 50% Gen Z, 40% Gen Y, and sort of the rest of the 10% are sort of X and older. And when we looked at those cohorts, you don't typically have a lot of joint accounts in that younger set. So
Right.
I guess we had this kind of decision of like, do we spend this, you know, joint accounts are kind of quite complex. Do we put this effort into, you know, a quite complex undertaking for a really small potential niche of customers? And I guess as we explored the opportunity, we started to understand that like there seemed to be a real need here for a way for two people in a relationship to collaborate on money, whether it's just sharing the odd bill or they're living together or they're at some other stage. And there was effectively like, we sort of scratched our head a bit as to why more people didn't have joint accounts. And when we looked into that, there were sort of a few key reasons that came up time and time again, you know, ideas around sort of this complete loss of privacy and independence, right? It's this coming together and meshing of lives. You know, excuse me, if the couple were maybe not in a, you know, unsure, like, oh, we've only been going out for 6 months or a couple of years, maybe we're not sure if it's going to pan out. Do we want all that life admin of opening and closing these things? And so yeah, we saw an opportunity to really reposition joint banking as kind of, you know, in our mind, like a two-player banking experience. But we needed to sell that to people, right? Because we effectively had a customer base that didn't maybe know they needed this in our mind. Right. And so we really, I think we do this a lot with our features, is we really think about how do we make this engaging and interesting, because, you know, we think if you think hard enough, a lot of this stuff can be, and not just present it as, you know, products over a channel. So, you know, it just seemed like this idea of like a cooperative game was a kind of a nice way to think about banking with someone else and spending and saving. And you know, I'm not going to lie, I think that we were like, we're not sure if this is going to land. People might think we're ridiculous for like positioning it this way. I think it's easy to look back and think, oh, these things are no-brainers. Of course, that would work. But at the time, there's always a sense of like, we're taking a risk here. We are going a bit out there, and we're not 100% sure if this will land the way we hope it does. You know, fortunately, they generally have been landing pretty well, and I think 2Up's a great example of that, where, you know, in our minds, we've sort of, I guess, created this, uncovered a big opportunity for, you know, that's not really service today. It's not, and it kind of, I guess, it speaks to the strengths of how Up approaches these problems as like an experience problem and a positioning problem, not just sort of the financial services part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting insight, because I like this idea that, you know, for me, it's really interesting, that idea of sort of, as you said, they're quick to spin up and quick to spin down as sort of the unique driving insight behind that product. And as someone that, has, you know, multiplayer banking obviously in my life now, I mean, I can't even imagine what it would be like to sort of go and disentangle all of that stuff. So, and I think particularly given the segment that, you know, as you mentioned with Gen Z, it's like, you know, I assume a lot of people are sort of, you know, going out, but maybe not sort of, you know, not there yet, that it's like, well, you know, we're committed forever or whatever. So I think that's really, really fascinating. How have the big banks responded to Up? I'm sort of curious. You have this very bold position and this very unique brand identity. How has the market responded? Have you seen them sort of try to copy, push against it? I mean, I know maybe you can't say too much, but I'm just curious as to how the sort of market has responded.
Yeah, I think you see, like, we notice responses, I guess, in different ways, and like I guess a couple of things that come to mind for me. Certainly, there was a period in Australia where there were maybe 3 or 4 so-called neobanks all kind of in the market and launching, or have recently launched, and so some of the bank CEOs were sort of effectively directly questioned, like, what do you think of these challenges? Are you worried? And I remember one of the CEOs of the Big Four had a quote something like, I don't mean to be dismissive, but I think that there's, more to it than, a nice app, right? Which was very dismissive, of course, but I think that they initially looked at the neobanks and just thought, like, these are just nice apps, like they're not really, their savings account's the same as our savings account. And I think they kind of completely missed the point, right? Which is, it's really the experience and the way and the engagement, the way you're bringing these things together. It's, Up is not fundamentally innovating at a financial product point, right? Like the way we maybe tie things together is where the secret sauce is. And I think there was an element of like dismissiveness in the, at first, but more and more we see, effectively copying, right? Like you say, oh, hang on, all of a sudden your release notes are very much like our release notes, or your cards have all turned vertical, or like just those little pieces over time. And of course, we hear the stories from people in the industry. It's like, oh, at this traditional bank, Up screenshots are just plastered all over the walls of the meeting rooms and that kind of stuff. So they're certainly aware of us and keeping a close eye on us, I'd say.
Yeah, that's it reminds me of a quote, that sort of, I guess maybe lack of self-awareness or whatever, but reminds me of a quote. I can't remember who it was, but it was some big TV executive in the US, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, who said in a meeting that, like, he said something along the lines of, there just aren't, and the context was talking about YouTube. And he said, there just aren't a million people in their bedrooms that are going to be able to make better content than us. And of course, it just, turned out to be completely untrue. And I think there's something about missing the point there, which I think is really interesting. Where do you think the market goes from here, guys? In a decade, are we in fundamentally the same spot where you have, the big four banks and a swath of, amazing challenges? Or do you think we can see more radical changes in the landscape in, let's say, just Australia?
I think, like, banking's like a really tough game. It's very, very expensive to create a bank. You need like a lot of capital, and there's a huge amount of regulatory overhead. And so the way you do it is very important. And, Up is sort of, in some ways, the lone survivor in the neobanking space in Australia, partially because of the way that we, attacked the problem, I guess. We effectively partnered with a traditional bank to provide the sort of, the ledger and the regulatory kind of like capability. The banks, the neos and startups that took that on themselves, like, really struggled. Because while the big four in Australia are incredibly profitable, on a global level, they're incredibly profitable banks, but it takes a lot to get to that stage. There's a long kind of ramp to get there. So I think it's a very challenging nut to crack in that regard. And so I think, there are technologies that are, and sort of initiatives, I guess, that are perhaps lowering the barriers. Things like the consumer data right and open banking can effectively make it, I guess, possible to sort of add value outside of being a core institution, maybe give a platform to build on top of. There are initiatives in Australia, is one called Pay2, which is really a way to, in theory, it will sort of enable portability of things like, your regular bills that to some extent people may feel locked into their current bank because, well, moving all of my all of the life admin involved in moving my bills and payees and things out of this bank just make switching a really high cost thing to consider. So I think to some extent there are some technologies that can enable more challenges to emerge, but at the same time they also have their own costs as well. And because they're sort of these regulatory kind of initiatives, they not just anyone can go and get like an API key to become an open banking accredited data recipient. You've got to have frameworks and processes in place to do that. So I think it's a very challenging industry in that regard. I think there are just a lot of inbuilt protections that make it hard to get into. So the crypto kind of craze is maybe on the wane at the moment a little bit, but it's almost like, does it take a completely a reboot of the economy to enable kind of a new model? Because I think at least in Australia, the big players have got it pretty locked down at the moment. I mean, obviously we have ambitions and we hope to crack it. I think we have a great share of customers, great growth, but getting to that next level of, can we get a great share of home loans and lending and other things in the future? That's still ahead of us.
Yep, that's exciting. I wanted to shift to some of the campaigns and I guess sort of activations and promotions that you run, and in particular one called Perk Up, which I just want to say is something that like we discuss all the time. For those that don't know, sort of Perk Up or random acts of free coffee, what is it?
Yeah, I can give a quick overview. I saw you guys featured in one of your Como blog articles, which was awesome. But essentially it runs in Australia for our Australian Up customers from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. depending on your local time each weekday. And if you buy your regular morning coffee with Up, we might randomly refund it basically to you immediately. So it's like very much a surprise and delight play. What's super nice about it is, rather than it being just sort of a spiky campaign, though, we've been running it for probably close to 4 years now, or three years at least. Anson can probably correct me. And I think we've given out, at least over 60,000 coffees, I reckon.
Oh, wow.
And, especially when that happens on a Monday, I think it, cheers people up. But yeah, it's super nice because it's essentially a promotion. You don't even need to know that you're entering it. It's very much surprise and delight, and you just get an instant notification being like, "Hey, James, that flat white was on us. Have a good one."
And it's what I think is so clever about it is it's such a shareable, like the emotion that elicits is it encourages so much sharing, which is what's so clever about it. Is if you I think there might be a hashtag, if you go and look on Instagram at the hashtag, people every day are sharing, my bank shouts me coffee, does yours, stuff like that, which I think is so clever. Where did it come from? I'm curious as to sort of maybe some of the creative origins and insights behind the campaign.
Yes.
Yeah. I think I guess maybe the most fundamental insight is that, that daily workday sort of coffee purchase is probably the most consistent and widespread purchase a customer, an Australian, possibly a human will make, right? Like that's the thing that you'll go buy that coffee. Particularly when we launched this around the office, part of the office ritual, get into work, pick up a coffee on the way, or go for a coffee with a couple of workmates. So from our point of view, that was sort of like an engagement point that was we could kind of would be broadly applicable to customers if we could get into. And I think the other parts of it were, I guess, like it just felt like a great way to kind of flex, in a sense, some of the things that make Up different to other banks, because it's a tough thing to explain to people. Hey, like there's this new bank and you should get excited about a bank and really think about moving there, because it's just one of those topics that people, they tend to switch off, right? Like please don't talk to me about banking. How could that possibly be an interesting subject? And so, we have a lot of technology and that makes things amazing, like this real-time activity feed. So you're really seeing, things appear instantly. and get notifications and things like that. We have auto categorization, so you're getting these great spending insights just out of the box with no sort of no work required to do that. So for us to say, look, in the time it takes for you to get the notification confirming your coffee, we could basically tell you that coffee was free. That flexes on sort of our ability to identify cafes and coffee spending and our ability to send effectively real-time information. So it kind of came together beautifully as a way to bring our sort of technology differentiators with this effectively daily habit too, because I think that's part of the ultimate game as well. If there's this thing that you're doing regularly, and up can be the card that you pull out of your wallet to do that, like that's a great way for us to sort of build that share of wallet and build that kind of, that use case of like, why should I start using up? There's a chance your coffee will be free, and that will sort of lead you into maybe discovering more of the great benefits of up.
Yeah. I wonder what percentage of customers are playing that sort of coffee roulette in their mind every day. Like, I wonder sort of like if you've spoken to customers about like when you go to hit that card, are you actually like, how sort of autopilot is it versus like, oh, come on,
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I think, we probably want like a bit of both sets of cohorts, right? Because we've definitely seen people have like, multiple wins and tweet about that and whatnot. And as Anson said, the original kind of insight or desire was about forming a habit and the usage of up. So we want people to know, like, oh, if I use my card again and I get into the habit of buying my coffee with up, I might win again. So there's definitely an aspect of that. That's why it's a sort of loyalty play. That's why, it's sort of, in part, there's some retention metrics and stuff behind that.
Right.
But I think, hopefully it's not too many people knowingly thinking about it, because I feel like when it's properly surprising, especially for new customers in their first couple of weeks, I feel like that's when it's really like a nice sort of hit and taste of like, hey, like, up's a bit different to, any other financial institution I've used before.
Yeah. I mean, just getting that message is absolutely sort of memorable and, cut through is there. A last question before we move on to the quick fire round. So you mentioned loyalty, Seb. How do you guys think about building loyalty, both with maybe sort of brand and product? And I guess, what does it mean to be loyal? Because, I had a chat with Tom Goodwin on the podcast the other day, and he sort of pushed back on this idea of loyalty and said, sort of how much loyalty is really loyalty versus just lock-in or habit, which is like, well, yeah, I buy the same, dishwasher liquid every week. Not because I'm loyal, but because it's like, well, it's the one that I know and I grab it every week. How do you think about the question of loyalty and building loyalty?
Yeah. Anson can probably build on this, but I guess what I'd say is like, loyalty's nice, but what's more important, and I'd say this coming from sort of that growth marketing aspect, but advocacy is really the more important thing. Like, loyalty, cool, but you want people to be loyal amongst other things so that they can have a positive experience of the product, and then it drives value for them, but then in turn they advocate for you. And 75% of our customers or more come in through essentially referral. I say essentially because part of that is our actual referral program, Hook Up a Mate. But then we know from our sort of post sign up survey, another chunk of that referral is more kind of quote unquote recommendation through word of mouth. And so that high degree of advocacy and driving those sort of growth loops, I'm a big fan of Andrew Chan and that sort of growth loop type model, is super important for us as a business. Essentially, especially when we're competing with like some of the biggest brands in the country, So we have okay budgets, but having really strong growth loops and having really strong advocacy, whether that be through referrals or through wearing merch or through sharing on socials, is like absolutely essential for us. And I think that's more the key than just loyalty.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Oh, sorry, Anson.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I was going to just sort of add, I guess I think one thing we do quite differently in that space is we really look to, I guess, make life better on the upside for our customers. Like, it's not that that all of the romancing and courting is in the sign up funnel, and then now you're in. And so, good luck to you. We'll focus on the next new target. It's like we really, I think Perk Up's an example of this, and some other things we do. I mean, I think there are lots of examples, but it's about how do we make our customers, how do we win them over, not just once, but kind of all the time, or as much as possible, where that's delighting with little small, like Easter egg kind of features, being just, the incredible kind of, I guess, communications we have back and forth with customers, celebrating their upperversary, as we call it. So we kind of celebrate the day they joined, and every year we kind of have a reminder and some new artwork, and they were able to tie that into our referral program, for example, so that every year you might get a little bit more money for your referrals. So we're kind of building in the sense of, I think a lot of, with businesses at times, I think customers think, I've been a customer for 10 or 20 years, surely they value that, and often they feel disappointed when that doesn't seem to be the case. So I think we're really conscious of really, I guess, having a healthy relationship with our customers and continuing to invest in it throughout their time on up. And, that's, I feel like that's not often seen in this industry.
Right. No, I think those are both like really, really interesting insights. And I think sort of that idea of moving from, repeat purchase being the metric for loyalty to more of that advocacy, I think makes perfect sense. I'd like to go to the quick fire round. So short answers. And I'd like to start with, maybe a question to both of you, which is, what is your favorite marketing campaign of all time?
I've got a quick answer for that, which is the Only on Airbnb, which is their sort of repeat campaign where, around the world they do, some unbelievable property that can be booked and stayed at for a short period of time.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah, mine is the Get a Mac campaign. It was the Apple campaign with Justin Long and John Hodgman, when they're basically talking about the very technical topics in an incredibly relatable, lighthearted way. I just thought that was a brilliant series. I mean, I wouldn't be the first person to say that, but yeah, that's certainly up there for me.
I think you're literally the fourth person in like 5 episodes to have mentioned that, which it speaks to its brilliance clearly. I don't know if you guys saw the other day, by the way, Justin Long switched. Microsoft hired him, which I thought, that's sad. Yeah, that was sad. Sort of, there was something about capitalism and money buying absolutely everything that made me really sad. So the name of this show is Own the Moment, and I guess that's sort of that's the mantra that we go and talk to our customers and brands about, which is seizing every moment and sort of driving as much value as you can, which I think is something that that's been a red thread throughout this discussion. What does that idea mean to you? And can you come up with any examples of other brands that you think do that really well, that sort of, seize the moment, which perhaps other brands sort of let slip?
Anson might kill me for this because he's a Kiwi, but I was, again, thinking about the sort of travel sphere. And, I mentioned Only on Airbnb because I love that repeatable nature, the consistency of their Only On campaign. But I think Tourism New Zealand and what they did around Lord of the Rings a number of years ago, like the kind of the hype and the vibe around that film franchise, and their cleverness as a tourism agency to go all in on that for Brand New Zealand and tie in with different partnerships with Air New Zealand and safety, in-flight safety videos and whatever. Like they owned that hype. To the extent where some crazy metrics came out where it was like, 7 or 8 or 9% of people coming to New Zealand were coming because of Lord of the Rings. And I just feel like
that's insane.
It's so hard in a sector like that to have measurable impact. And I think, even to this day, I think they're still kind of, they're still probably kind of, feeding off that. But yeah, I hope it sort of didn't ruin your country too much, Anson.
Yeah. That's a great one.
Mate, I think you Aussies had to live through the whole Crocodile Dundee thing in the 80s and 90s. So I think Lord of the Rings is probably my preference of those two. But I was thinking about this question. I thought I actually was probably looking a bit more internally at us. But I think that for me, it's kind of, I guess, being honest and authentic having an honest and authentic voice without pandering to customers. And I think I just remember one moment when I thought we did this really well was during the pandemic in 2020, when like a lot of brands I think were, oh, like it's time to have Zoom cocktail parties and do trivia. And it was just all that kind of Pollyanna look at the bright side stuff, not acknowledging that it's like kind of a shitty time for a lot of people and a tough time. And I think that, one of our team that works on content just kind of wrote a very heartfelt, some really heartfelt words in the newsletter around that time about, like this kind of sucks, right? Like this is kind of a tough time. And I just thought and I think you used the word shitty, and that was interesting, like certain people raise their eyebrows at, oh, hang on, are you allowed to say that if you're a bank? But I just thought that was, I don't know, like people responded incredibly to that, right? Because it was just, I think that's just a great lesson there to acknowledge that our customers are humans, and that, there's a range of emotions that they'll engage with our brand. And that if we only look at the positive ones and only talk to that, we're kind of missing an opportunity for empathy and connection that that can be maybe even more powerful at times. And I think I'm sure there are brands that have done that well, but I don't have good examples.
I think those are both great examples. And I think on that, speaking to customers, like they're real people or whatever, I think it's also an interesting insight for me, because as a bank, I mean, right, people's financial lives are absolutely not, all roses, right? It's one of the primary drivers of stress, I guess, for a lot of people, sadly. And so I think that idea that you can be authentic and, understanding, and even just that example with the breakup from earlier, I think was a really good example. All right, what do you guys think is the most overrated trend in marketing right now?
I'm going to go a bit counter to what I heard Tom Goodwin saying, and just say like TikTok. And I say that just to elaborate, because we obviously, because of the demographic we target, we love that channel. We do heaps on it. We were the first brand in Australia to do a gamified effect. I think one of the first brands in the world, actually, within our sector. So fantastic channel, fully immersive. Definitely interesting native content. But I think I come back to that idea of like, a marketing strategy should never be a channel, even if it's a native, interesting new channel. Like, it always starts with, first and foremost, like, what's the human behavior? What's the insight there? And then from that, there's an idea, which is channel agnostic, like the only on Airbnb one. And then from there, you then decide on, what are the channels or what are the way to execute this? And so I just feel like with anything, the channel is never the answer. And I think sometimes, you hear people doing that because otherwise there'll always be a new channel, right? So just like start with the human insight, then, develop a broader idea, and then decide on your mix.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys sat through, we need a NFT strategy or I totally agree. I think, Mark Ritson always talks about, right, the fundamentals of marketing never change and will never change. The channels and the tools and the tactics will evolve, but the way to do good marketing will actually probably never change, starting with human insight, as you say. That's a great one. What about you, Anson?
Yeah, we didn't compare our answers on this, but I've basically had the same thing. I think just jumping on social media bandwagons, that gold rush mentality of like, hey, it's a new thing. We can get there and get sort of an outsized share of voice. And I think, it can be done well, obviously, but often it ends up being way too one-sided. And, I think like there's opportunities. I think I just personally, I just love kind of thinking outside the box and looking at things that have been overlooked and trying to understand like what's the opportunity there. And like just a small example was, our release notes, the notes that you would see in an app store listing that pretty much always just say bug fixes and performance improvements. We were like, we'll never write one of those. And almost like the less we release in an app store update, the more we write. It's kind of funny. It's like backwards. But we just saw that as a really fun channel to mess with. And and it kind of became a thing, I guess. And it's another thing we saw other brands starting to do more. Maybe there are others doing before us, but we certainly hadn't seen that. And then, I think just taking something that people think has got no juice left in it and finding a way to spin it, I think is a great creative challenge.
That's really good. That's a fun. That's going to be a clip, Anson. I think you're right. Finding the things that everyone has sort of left behind, and finding out how to sort of revitalize. I think that's a great insight. So the opposite, I guess, and maybe that was your answer. But what's the tactic that no one is talking about that we really should be? I guess underrated is another way to frame that.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think maybe this is more than a tactic, but it's been good, at least in the Australian landscape, to see certain brands, especially big brands, like embracing and highlighting, diverse cultural and ethnic segments within the community. And, within Australia, I think in the last census or something, at least, over half of Australians had a parent born overseas. So there's massive cultural diversity here. And I think you've seen at one level a lot of marketers and brands lean into that at a sort of campaign advertising level. But what I don't think we've seen enough in Australia, and you have seen this overseas, is where that actually then flows down into like a product level. We're having two good conversations recently that made me think about this at Up, and the fact that we're working on it. One was around sort of some members of the team who were just finishing Ramadan, and we were talking about kind of some of the functionality that we already have around savers and roundups, and I wonder how that could be sort of used well for sort of donations for celebrations like Ramadan. And then another conversation we were having was talking about Lunar New Year and the sort of the tradition of the red cash envelope. And
right.
I think WeChat does a digital version of that, and that made me think, and someone else was talking about it as well in the team about how might we actually lean into that? And I just think that idea of like recognizing the diversity within the community and the market you're in, but then going beyond just marketing it and sort of being perhaps a bit tokenistic and actually thinking about how that goes into your product. And I think, a really great example of that in the last couple of years was Nike releasing the athlete's hijab and and modest swimwear and that sort of stuff. And I think it's something we've spoken about internally, and a really rich area for us to kind of lean into in the future at a product marketing and product level.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other like red threads that I'm picking up throughout this discussion is like this idea of being like customer centric for real or something. I don't know, or it's like actually listening to the customer rather than just sort of sticking to that very sort of surface level. I think that's interesting. What about you, Anson? What's the underrated? What's the tactic that we're not adopting that we really should be, or talking about, or thinking about?
Yeah, I think I'd just probably expand on my previous answer. I think look at those things you do that you are kind of just going through the motions of, and think about how you could turn those on their head and make them completely just blow people's minds, because it's almost you kind of have the setup, right? People see this thing and they think it's going to be a certain thing, and you do that, and that's fine. But if you can turn that on its head, that's a pretty amazing moment if you can pull it off. And I think another one we did was like our roadmap, right? Like early days, it's effectively this incredibly mature industry, banking, where people want 1,000 things out of the box, and we launched with the classic agile MVP approach. And so we needed a way to kind of signal that, hey, some of this stuff's coming, and so we're like, we should publish a roadmap. And it was not a new thing to have kind of like what people used to use. I forget the name of that app, like the board, the board of cards where you can move them all around. Trello. Yeah, Trello.
Oh, like Trello.
That was big at the time, huge. So it was like the now next future thing. But we thought, we kind of had this moment of like, the way we're building this, it kind of feels like those games you play. We have that technology tree where everything kind of, you build one thing and you can build two more things. And what if we use that as kind of a way to communicate this? And so we went from like, hey, this is just our roadmap of what's coming, to this kind of thing that had its own kind of momentum and kind of spread around, at least in product and design circles, certainly, and sort of became a star of it in its own right. And I think like it's just a great example again of like, how can we make this thing like bigger than people are expecting, because everyone expects a super awesome TikTok account or or a great whatever it is, but what's the thing that we're going to just surprise people and knock it out of the park? They're hard, they're not easy to come up with them, but I
think it's a really interesting like creative cue almost for people to like, I think it is a very clear and actionable takeaways, right? It's like, right, I like that. It's like everyone expects the YouTube channel or the TikTok account to be, fun and engaging and memorable, but it's like, and I think, even what, I don't know if you were the first, but like the vertical cards, it feels like another example of like, it's different. You don't expect it. It's sort of, it's a distinctive brand asset, I guess. So I think that's a really, really good one. All right, last question. Who is the most interesting marketer in the world right now, according to you guys? Or favorite maybe, but...
Well, you go first, Anson.
I don't have an answer here at all. Probably someone that none of us have heard of, like with their own YouTube channel, just who's going to blow up to like 100 million subscribers in the next 6 months.
What I was going to say, just because I'm a fanboy of this brand, is Yvonne Chouinard, who's behind Patagonia. And I, not a marketer, I'm very much like a bit of an anti-capitalist, but I just think, I'm a massive fan of the brand for a whole bunch of reasons. But recently, with the whole giving away the company to a foundation and whatnot, just from him and his whole company, they're just incredible in terms of subverting what you expect of them, a bit like what Anson was saying. And I think even though he's essentially a retired older guy now, I feel like he would never call himself a marketer, but actually having read his biography a couple of months ago, I think he's actually a brilliant marketer, up there with the Steve Jobses of the world and whatnot. So
absolutely.
Yvonne Chouinard.
Yeah, it's a great one because I think in a time where so many companies are sort of criticized of, I guess, virtue signaling or, whatever, to really sort of put his money literally where his mouth is, I think is extremely admirable. Guys, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed this.
Pleasure.
It was awesome, James. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Own the Moment podcast. If you liked this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss upcoming episodes. And to suggest a guest or provide feedback, please visit our dedicated podcast hub at ownthemomentpod.com.